Welcome everyone. Today's presentation is part of the Culture Builds Communities webinar series. This community-based project is designed to help Native communities plan and develop cultural facilities. Culture Builds Communities is a project of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Major funding is provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Museum of the American Indian, and Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies. Thank you so much for being here today, Art.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and this is a test drive for the series, I guess, and starting with first steps for developing tribal museums and cultural centers. So thank you. It's really a good thing when you're considering your museum and your cultural center to take a holistic approach, look at the big picture. And that way, you know, you're going to start well. You can put in your inspirations and your aspirations, and your potential outcomes are also clarified a bit right up front. It's a time to model best practices, both for the museum industry and for your own community. And you can make sure that the project is aligned with your values and the practices of your community as you go ahead. Now, the next bit concerns questions that every museum should ask of itself and probably should have 50 years ago, if it's that old. You need to ask, what's your mission? What are you doing here? Who do you do it for? And are there limits upon it? Do you limit it by geography or by time or by place? Governance, what rules will govern you in your operations, and how does the work get divided up and the authority allocated? Who gets to make the decisions that need to be made along the way? And as you're building your new workplace, how will you ensure that you all get along and that everyone is working together for the same thing? And particularly when you're starting out, it's so important that you make provisions to have your board trained in governance issues and your staff trained in museum ethics and best practices, particularly if you're starting up fresh and don't have a lot of experienced people with you. You'll need to make sure you get those trainings at meetings like the ATOM meetings. So who's going to be responsible and how will you be funded? Those are really big questions. And if you think about it up front, you're better positioned to make decisions at each step. It might affect how fast you get to do your project, but you also need to make sure that it's realistic. Who's going to direct your museum and how will you recruit that person? There are some communities that have planned ahead and actually sent their young people off to colleges or museum studies programs to get training and then get some experience before they come back to run the eventual museum in the community. You also have to decide who's going to be paid and who needs to volunteer. How many people will you ultimately need on the opening day? And figuring the staff pattern is very important. Most of your unless some of you are in tribal planner or THPO offices, almost everyone else will be paid or volunteered to start, but then you'll start hiring some staff because nobody likes to work for free, even if they love the subject matter. A lot of thought for all museums needs to be put into who are your publics and what interpretive methods will you use to reach them. And, you know, previously that might have been a matter of just how you arrange your exhibits in the facility. Today, that also includes what's your digital presence going to be, your virtual presence. Will you be able to reach out worldwide with your stories? And so technology is a consideration when planning your facilities. First, what stories do you want to tell, and then what collections are available or do you need to find to serve your purpose? Maybe you've got a long-standing collection. Maybe you have done a lot of surveying to know what other museums have things from your community. And maybe there are some NAGPRA-related collections that might be suitable, at least to talk about in, or the process of repatriation in your museum. Museums need to ask themselves, what provisions will you make for ongoing research? You know, the larger museums have specialized curators, and they go and do exotic things in exotic places. Today, not so much, and smaller institutions really aren't mounting field expeditions. But you know, you don't want to be extractive anyway. You want to be additive. You want to be adding things to and for your community. You're not going out to study other people. You need to study yourself a little to make sure that you're selling the right stories. And you'll want to be doing some research, evaluating your programs and finding out more every year what your visitors and what your supporters really want. What physical facilities do you require? And what's your timeline, and what security will you need? You know, does your facility need to be representative of the ethos of your group, or can it just be utilitarian, protecting collections and providing good spaces for meeting? That's part of the planning process you'll hear more about in this series. Very important for everyone. The worst thing that can happen to museums is that they become complacent, and they might even be post-classic, over the hill, and not even know it. So figuring out how you're going to cope with changes, how will you conduct your ongoing planning, how will you evaluate your activities, and how do you keep things alive but still closely connected to your community? Very important questions today. And the planning, it's really important. If you have a good plan and the first part of it gets you to your facility, make sure that you're also planning at the same time how you're going to operate, what your programs will be. And then every few years, review your plan every year a little, and then every couple of years, push it out a few more years so that it's never done. You keep creating and you keep being in the future. Now, these are questions that are more specific, drill down from those first 20 questions. And they can be customized for your community, reflects your location and your history and your traditions. So, very important up front, why are you creating your museum and cultural center? And there are several big reasons, and cultural and language preservation is a very popular one. As an educational adjunct to other tribal education initiatives, or economic development, and usually some kind of a combination of those three. And the other question is about your commitment. Are you committed to start up strategic planning that will guide your future activities? It's really good to spend the time up front on these things. And does your community have its own comprehensive plan that relates to housing and development and economic growth? And ask yourself, where would your museum or center fit within that plan? Things always are more possible if they're inside a comprehensive plan for the larger community. And a big question also is, have you completed a community needs assessment where you use surveys or interviews or public meetings to get in touch with the people in your community, ask them what they need, what they want, and how they'd like to see you work up front. That will really inform the shape of your project going forward. This is another big one and a very fundamental question. Have you looked at the different ways that your museum could be governed? Some places have a tribal council or a business council. Some communities have set up private nonprofits or foundations, and some are mixtures with tribal and private partnerships. It's really good to have that lined out ahead, and if it is a nonprofit, to have a very good kind of operating agreement that sets the limits of what the nonprofit can do. Usually the board members of the private nonprofit are tribal council appointees, and occasionally they're not if they want to have a number of board members from outside the community. But it's worth looking at closely, and there are some pros and cons to all of them. Part of the community needs assessment and part of the inspiration I know that many of you had to apply to be part of this cohort is that you do have connections and champions that you'll need. And it's important that they're able to work successfully within your governance system. And very, very important thing, do you have the right community scholars, knowledge keepers, and other important stakeholders that you will hopefully know about already or meet through the needs assessments and community engagement. Some communities bring in outside scholars who might be famous for knowing things from the outside, but there is so much more knowledge where you live that you shouldn't leave it out. Have you identified some other departments within your tribal government and institutions in and around your community that can help you? The work is always easier with multiple hands involved, and you can assess pretty well what kind of a partner you can be. Can they be funding partners for you? Can they help you with programming? Can they help train your staff? Are there things you can do on contract for others that help you, that also helps them and brings some income in? And of course, the big question for everyone these days is how can you be organized to ensure financial sustainability? The truth is that most museums in America of any kind are totally undercapitalized, and they have to work, if they're working on earned income alone, starting every year with a zero slate and working like mad to balance the budget. So when you consider all the different ways that you can create income for yourself, it's important to put that into the early planning as well, so that the facility structure and organization of your space might be impacted by whether you have a store or a restaurant, whether you take admissions or voluntary donations, what kind of program fees you might charge if you have organized lectures and other programs. All very important to look at up front. There are a lot of things that are actually only available to tribal governments, and block grants and capital improvement, state funds. Some states have designated funding for Native American groups through their Indian Affairs Commission. And you'll hear more about that later in the series. When you're looking at your audiences, have you received guidance from cultural leaders regarding protocols on traditional knowledge and what and how information can be shared with others? And making sure that things that aren't public stay private. Also, how can your museum help to ensure knowledge transmission between elders and children? And that's, whether that's cultural traditions or language preservation. You know, grandparents are usually great teachers, and I hope that you can plan that in, whether it's space for activity or whether it's formal programs, something to really think about. Another natural ally internally would be your NAGPRA staff, if you have them in your THPO office, and what connections can you have and how can you help each other mutually in facilitating. Sometimes, you know, in the process, it's museum to museum. And so if you can work directly with your NAGPRA people on some of those functions, if that's desired, it's a good thing. And I'm sure you have NAGPRA inventories, but do you have other information you've gathered about museums that have community materials that you might be able to borrow for short-term or very long-term loans? And one of the resources for that is the School for Advanced Research Indian Art Research Center guidelines that will be posted as a resource for you. They have them for communities working with museums and vice versa, so that productive long-term relationships can be started and maintained. Have you received some guidance from your cultural leaders about how objects can be stored, studied, conserved, and managed? And how can they also be respected and fed if they need to be? Those are things that are good to talk about ahead of time as well. And there's a lot more actual general practice that's being, you know, created around the country as more museums are started up. And on the research end, you know, the general question for museums was, how can you do ongoing research? The specific question for you is going to be, how can you bring knowledge and value to the work of other tribal departments? And if your tribe has protocols regarding any research by outsiders or insiders, how will that help to guide your operations? And I'm sure that many of you are very much aware of how that works, but make sure that you have that conversation. And again, coming back to architecture, can the facilities be designed to reflect your specific cultural values on a grand scale? And can you design them to provide varying levels of access? Some museums have parts of the building that only tribal members can use. Some are a little more expansive, allowing people from other tribes, and some have more general exhibit halls and meeting spaces where anyone can come. And again, that's important to talk about that up front before you get into the design process. And I think it's important to note that every community has a slightly different style of tribal administration, and that some turn over their chairs annually, some every 2 years, some have seemingly lifetime appointments. And the truth is that priorities change when administrations change. So you need to be nimble enough to see what's happening and make sure that you can roll with it as things change. Now, there are documents with details on the website, and also a direct link, if you like, to the SAR guidelines for collaboration. And ultimately, this presentation will be there as well for you. Now, we know that you're all starting up, but you're at different points along the way. So you'll need to answer all those questions from your point of view. And it's good to see that many of your answers were already considered in your applications to join the cohort. And if you contact us, we will review and comment, critique, suggest, perhaps offer other resources as you go along the way. And eventually, you're all going to get to Washington, D.C. To visit the National Museum of the American Indian. And it would really be good reading to review those guidelines for communities as you prepare for your visit when you get to do that. And I want to thank you for taking the time to come this morning, and best wishes to everybody. And we hope that you'll take the time to attend the webinars and to review the resources and use them for your own. Copy them, adapt them, whatever you need to do. So thanks again.